Hello and welcome everybody to our Provider Standardisation training webinar. My name is Jackie Vincent and I'm the Chief Moderator for our T-Level provision. So welcome again to the Provider Standardisation training webinar. The aim of today is to revisit some of the key information related to the planning, assessment and moderation of Assignment 2. We'll also explore the marking criteria for structured observations, and we'll get to assess part of an observation narrative for the early years educator and assisting teaching occupational specialism. And this will support assessors to have a standardised approach to assessing and marking the structured observations for Assignment 2. The moderation team will also use the same materials for internal standardisation. The other agenda items will include key terminology, Assignment 2 overview, resources available, planning, Early Years Educator Assignment 2 Part 1, Early Years Educator Assignment 2 Part 2, and Assisting Teaching Assignment 2. And we'll also look at moderation. As some of you attending the webinar today are from our Wave 2 providers, we would like to revisit some of the key terms used during the moderation of the Education and Childcare T-Level. We'll also provide an overview of Assignment 2. However, please be reminded that there is more detail on this in the Administration Training webinar. Many of you will use similar terms for other qualifications. Therefore, we'd like to clarify the context in which they are used. So the moderator is an external NCFE moderator who will carry out the moderation of Assignment 2, and we're going to explore Assignment 2 in detail. The moderator will carry out observations of the student alongside the provider assessor. So wherever you see this term used throughout the specification or any other resources, we are referring to external NCFE moderators and the moderation activity that they will complete. The moderation of Assignment 2, Part 2 and 2 for Early Years Educator and Assignment and Assisting Teaching will be completed by visiting the industry placements with the provider assessor. The moderator is also sometimes referred to as the external assessor, and this is because the moderator will also assess the student during the visit. The provider assessor is the assessor completing the observation of students for Assignment 2 for each occupational specialism. The assessor must be competent to make assessment decisions against the appropriate occupational specialism, and there's further guidance regarding competence available in the qualification specification. The schedule of assessment is accessed via the portal and is a working document. Once the schedule of assessment has been submitted, you'll be able to revisit to add or change any information that you've shared. And you'll need to include details such as the student name, industry placement, date of observation, time of observation, criteria to be covered, the number of the structured observation if relevant, name of the assessor, and in addition, we'll ask you to rank order your students. And to do this, you'll take into consideration results at Key Stage 4, predicted overall grade, and predicted grade for your occupational specialism. The moderation team will use this to plan their visits, and there's a direct link to our guidance resource on slide 7. So the industry placement is the placement that students will attend, and this will reflect the occupational specialism that's been chosen by the student. Providers will need to seek permission for moderators to access the industry placement. The schedule of assessment will include a declaration that this has been granted by the industry placement, and the moderator will ask to see evidence of this. So internal quality assurance. All assignments for the T-level are externally marked or moderated by NCFE. Therefore, completed assignments are not formally signed off by an internal quality assurer. It is, however, expected that the IQA will still be responsible for the standardisation of practice and assessment processes. And this is especially applicable to Early Years Educator Part 1, where the IQA will continue to check the quality of assessment decisions once the moderator has passed the provider assessors to continue assessing the cohort for Part 1. And records of standardisation and other internal quality assurance processes will be checked during the annual monitoring review completed between August and November annually. And it is expected that providers will standardise the process for capturing observations and professional discussions, the forms used and the detail to be included. Additionally, the marking criteria of structured observations. So assignment 2, these assessments are designed to test to what extent a student can meet the key skills and underpinning knowledge required to successfully work as an early years educator practitioner or as a teaching assistant. And the tutor guidance document explains the nature and purpose of the assessments and should be used alongside the student pack. And for those completing the early years educator occupational specialism, you will also need to refer to the EYE competence criteria. So assignment 2 consists of 2 parts for the early years occupational specialism. Assignment 2 part 1 is the competency assessment for early years occupational specialism. And assignment 2 part 2 is the structured observations. So please be reminded that the assisting teaching occupational specialism does not include assignment 2 part 1, and students completing this occupational specialism will complete the structured observations only for assignment 2. Both parts of assignment 2 must be completed along with all other required assessments if a student is to achieve a technical qualification with the Early Years Educator occupational specialism. It's split into two for part 1 and part 2 in order to assess 2 important aspects of a student's achievement. I'm sure most of you will be quite confident with the resources that we have available on the website. And in addition, many of you will have accessed the CPD support available from our curriculum team and the resources and guidance shared by the subject specialist team. Further information on webinar dates can also be found on QualHub. The resources shown here are also accessible on QualHub, and these will support you with the planning and implementation of assignment 2. So just as a reminder, for each of the occupational specialisms, we have the occupational specialism tutor guidance, assignment 2 student guide, assignment 2 tutor guide, the assisting teaching or the early years educator guide standard exemplification materials. And for the early years educator, we have the EYE competence criteria. We would also like to remind you of the webinars available on QualHub, and you can see those we've delivered most recently listed here. So planning the observations. Some of you will have already planned your first moderation visit with your allocated moderator. I would just like to add here that moderators are getting booked up very quickly. So if you are a Wave 1 provider and you've not yet booked your first visit, please do so at your earliest opportunity so that we can support you to complete all visits within the assessment window. As a reminder, you will only be allocated a moderator once you have booked your students onto the occupational specialism for the second year. Thank you to those who have already booked onto the occupational specialism, and for those providers who have started delivery this year and have already booked students onto your occupational specialism for delivery for 2022-23 assessment window, you will be allocated a moderator in August of 2022, and this is so that visits can be planned for year 2. The schedule of assessment will show all planned observations and the relevant detail of the cohort for the second year of the programme. Moderators will select their sample using the information provided, and a link to the pre-recorded resource is found here. So planning for Early Years Educator Part 1. So the observation planning form or the initial planning form should be used to plan the observations that the assessor will make of the student at their industry placement. And this form will detail the date of the observations, the intended activity to be observed, and the criteria expected to be covered. And this is based on the guidance shared. All early years competence criteria will need to be covered. Early Years Educator Part 2 and Assisting Teaching Structured Observations should be planned by the provider in agreement with the industry placement and the student, and this should be done well in advance. Activities are written to naturally reflect regularly occurring activities in the setting, and providers should make use of regular provision to accommodate these observations. It should be confirmed that the activity will allow the student to cover all criteria as far as is reasonably possible. Students should lead the activities with no input from the provider's assessor. Students can interact as required with other practitioners based on the requirements of the activity, and all planned activities will need to be carried out in line with the settings, policies, and procedures at all times. Students should be aware of when they will be observed for their structured observations and what activities they will be carrying out. So the first observation type we're going to explore is the Early Years Educator Assignment 2 Part 1. Just as a reminder, this can be taken at any time during delivery. As it's designed to assess competency, it must be observed at the industry placement. The provider-appointed assessor must carry out the observations. Assessors can begin observations of students whenever they believe the student is ready to show skill at the level of competency. All early years educator competence criteria will need to be observed and achieved by the student. The criteria include skills and knowledge. Please be reminded that assessments must only include observations and professional discussion where this is acceptable. Professional discussion will need to be planned, and the student can make reference to work products during the discussion. The competence observation criteria document can be used as a portfolio style resource. Assessors can sign off the achieved criteria as soon as they feel the student is ready to be observed and the criteria is met. Assessors observing students can give formative feedback to students after each observation. For example, if a student achieves a working towards level on a particular criteria, they can be given feedback as to what they would need to demonstrate on a future observation to prove competency. There is no limit to the number of observations that the provider chooses to carry out for the student. However, the forms and documentation have been designed to allow the assessor to plan observations so that they will be as efficient as possible in evidencing the student's competency. Students must have demonstrated competency in all criteria before they can be considered for achievement of the occupational specialism. And as mentioned previously, an observation planning form must be completed by each student and shared with the assessor and placement supervisor ahead of any observation. Observations should be planned holistically as good practice, and this will enable observation of several criteria. The observation record must be completed holistically by the assessor using the student's planning form as a guide. The professional discussion form should be used to complete a record of the discussion between the assessor and the student. Students can be observed as often as required to meet the criteria. The completed example on QualHub provides clear guidance on what should be included in each of the forms required for Part 1. The observation of skills planning form should be used to make a narrative record of each planned observation conducted by the assessor. Each observation form must be numbered for referencing purposes. The professional discussion form, where relevant and only for specified criteria, can be used to confirm a student's understanding. In these instances, the form should be used and be numbered with the same number as the observation of skills recording form and linked back to the criteria that the assessor feels have been covered during the discussion. The future planning form should be used after each observation to confirm the outcome of the observation and plans for any future observations. The criteria, assessor, judgment, guidance, and assessment justification must be used to capture an assessment judgment for each criteria, with a justification clearly linking back to the relevant evidence of the observation of skills forms and any professional discussion form. And these forms should be completed to some degree after each observation, for example, to record an initial justification for a particular judgment. They should only be completed in full after all observations have been carried out and the provider is ready to submit the student's evidence for final achievement. The final judgment form should be used to confirm a final judgment of the student's competence against the early years educator criteria as a whole, and there is a deadline in the second year of the student's T-level qualification for the final marks to be submitted, and you should refer to the key dates schedule to look at the most up-to-date information. So the IQA will look at assignment 2, but as assignment 2 is externally moderated, the standardisation of practice and process is expected to continue and will support accurate judgment against the early years educator criteria, and as previously highlighted in slide 3. IQAs will continue to sample the quality of assessment and accuracy of assessment decisions, and this will support the development of assessment practice following provider internal quality assurance processes. The moderator will visit the industry placement with the assessor, carry out the same observation with the assessor, and moderate the assessment decisions made by the assessor, and the moderator will share feedback with the assessor following assessment. A report capturing the outcome of the visit and any identified actions or areas for development will also be produced. So Early Years Educator Part 2, let's remind ourselves of how Assignment 2 Part 2 is assessed. There are 3 structured observations. So we've got structured observation 1, this is supporting children's learning and development. And this activity will assess the student's ability to support children's learning and development, making use of both planned and unplanned opportunities. Structured observation 2 is contributing to an enabling environment. And again, this activity will assess the student's ability to contribute to an enabling environment for children, making use of both planned and unplanned opportunities. And then we've got structured observation 3, meeting the individual needs of children. This activity will assess the student's ability to meet the individual needs of children through contributing to their care and well-being. Assignment 2 is marked by the provider and moderated by NCFE. As part of this standardisation training, we're going to explore the structured observation 1 for both occupational specialisms, and we will look at 2 examples from the early years educator and 2 from assisting teaching. All examples are of observation 1, and this will enable us to make comparisons. We will explore the marking criteria and the marks awarded for each example, and we will ask you to consider the mark that you would award. We will not be able to share individual responses, but we would ask that you use your findings as a starting point for standardisation activities to be completed within your teams and as part of your ongoing standardisation of practice. So first of all, we're going to look at Early Years Educator, Assignment 2, Part 2, Structured Observation 1. And as a reminder, that is supporting children's learning and development. The slide shows all of the criteria that should be captured during the observation. For this standardisation activity, we will review the observation record and focus on the following criteria or specification reference. S1.23. Engage in effective strategies to develop and extend children's learning and thinking. We'll use the narrative captured in the observation record and we will mark the observation reflecting the marking criteria specific to S1.23. So here we can see the marking criteria. The marking criteria, as a reminder, is included for all criteria assessed in each structured observation. Here you can see the marking criteria for S1.23. So please take time to read the marking criteria and use this to consider how you would assess and mark the observation on the following slide. So you might like to pause for a couple of moments just to read through the criteria before we move to the next slide. So on this slide, we can see the observation has been captured on the observation of skills recording form. And for the purposes of this training, we have only included the narrative and the criteria assessed. The assessor will also include the student's name, the date of the observation, the structured observation title and number, and the name of the assessor, and records should be signed and dated. The narrative and criteria achieved can be seen here on the screen. And prior to the start of the observation, the student would share their detailed plan. And the plan will clearly show the activity to be planned, the criteria planned to be covered, and how this will be met. In addition, any criteria to be covered by professional discussion will be highlighted. So please be reminded that professional discussion can only be planned for those criteria where professional discussion is permitted. Again, you might like to pause the presentation for a moment to read through the observation, considering the criteria that we are focusing on today. You'll notice that the narrative provides detail in a succinct way. It's important to remember that the record should tell the story and provide sufficient detail to support the assessment decision. So let's remind ourselves of the criteria we're assessing. So it's S1.23, engage in effective strategies to develop and extend children's learning and thinking. So how would you mark the criteria? So looking at the marking criteria, we can see that the observation has been graded as 4 marks. The marks for assignment 2 will contribute to the overall grade for the occupational specialism. This example is of a student working at distinction level. Please be reminded that the final grade boundaries for the occupational specialism will be agreed after the final moderation process. In this example, the marking criteria states that the student uses strategies effectively which are carefully selected and differentiated to develop and extend children's learning and thinking. The student is highly effective in confidently engaging with children in a range of ways and contexts, such as individual and group activities, to utilise all opportunities to extend children's learning and thinking. Following the observation, the assessor will provide a commentary to justify the assessment decision and the marks awarded. And the assessor commentary can be captured holistically or individually. And the commentary must include relevant and specific justification for each assessment. As you can see, professional discussion is not allowed for this criteria. However, where professional discussion is permitted, records should be as detailed as possible with the justification included in the commentary. Records should also include sufficient narrative that justifies the assessment decision and the outcome of the structured observation. And as a reminder, digital voice recordings are permitted and are a really effective way to capture the discussion. So this example of an observation has also been captured on the observation of skills recording form. And this is an abstract from one of the examples that we've got on Qualhub. The assessor again records the student name, date, structured observation, title, and the number and the name of the assessor. The narrative and criteria achieved can be seen here again on the screen. And in this example, the student shares the plan prior to the start of the observation, and the plan again will clearly show the activity planned, the criteria to be covered, and how will be met. In addition, any criteria to be covered by professional discussion will be highlighted. So please take a few minutes to read through the observation, considering the criteria that we're focusing on today. And as a reminder, it's S1.23. Engage in effective strategies to develop and extend children's learning and thinking. And remember, again, each criteria has a maximum of 4 marks. So how are you going to mark this student? Let's remind ourselves of the marking criteria. How would you have marked that observation? Please consider your decision and the justification. Is that student demonstrating the same level of competence as the previous example that we've already looked at? So looking at the marking criteria, you can see that this observation could be awarded 2 marks. So did you agree with that decision? You can see the marking criteria here will need further exploration and standardisation within your teams, and this will really help you further with applying the marking criteria in context. So to support with this, this is an example of a pass grade student. And this student uses appropriate strategies to develop and extend children's learning and thinking. They have confidence in engaging with children appropriately in ways that extend their learning and thinking. And as with the previous example, the assessor commentary can be captured holistically or individually, and the commentary must include the justification for assessment judgment, including the mark awarded. So let's look now at assisting teaching assignment 2. So assisting teaching again consists of 3 structured observations. Structured observation 1, support the class teacher to engage pupils in planned activities promoting literacy development. In this activity, the student will be expected to support the development of pupils' literacy in a way that is appropriate to their age and stage. Structured observation 2 is promote effective, inclusive teaching, learning, and assessment opportunities for pupils. And structured observation 3 is facilitate educational experiences to support holistic learning and well-being. At this point, it would be good to remind you that the criteria for each occupational specialism is covered across each of the assignments for the occupational specialism. So assisting teaching assignment 2. As with early years educator, assignment 2 for assisting teaching is marked by the provider and moderated by NCFE. Moderators will visit the industry placement and observe the assessment taking place, accompanying the provider assessor and observing the student carrying out their structured observation. The moderator will make assessment judgments, including the allocation of marks on assignment 2, using the same methods as the provider. All records and findings will be documented separately to the providers. So to ensure that the 2 sets of findings can be reliably compared at final moderation. So let's break down the requirements of assignment 2. Again, we're going to explore structured observation 1, which is support the class teacher to engage pupils in planned activities promoting literacy development. And the specification reference or criteria that you can see here are expected to be covered during structured observation 1. Each of the criteria, again, are marked individually with marking criteria provided for each criteria. On the next slide, we will explore one of the criteria in detail. We will again review the narrative from an observation and focus on one of the criteria. And we're going to look at S1.11, use appropriately varied vocabulary for age and development stage to ensure pupils' understanding. As with the previous example, please take time to read through the marking criteria for S111. Use appropriately varied vocabulary for age and development stage to ensure pupils' understanding. And this is marked 0 to 4. On this slide, you will see the record of observation. Again, in this example, the assessor will have captured the student's name, date, structured observation title and number, the name of the assessor, the narrative and criteria achieved can be seen here on the screen. Prior to the start of the observation, the student will have shared the detailed plan, and the plan will clearly show the activity plan, the criteria to be covered, and how this will be met. As a reminder, we are focusing on S111, so use appropriately varied vocabulary for age and developmental stage to ensure pupils' understanding. Please take a few minutes to read through the observation record and consider how you would mark this criteria, and also how would you capture your justification for the mark that you would give this observation. This observation is of a student that's been awarded 4 marks against this criteria. So did you agree with that outcome? So let's look at what 4 marks states. The student is highly effective and differentiated use of subject terminology to extend pupils' understanding. They have highly effective use of prompts and targeted questioning techniques have been used to assess each pupil's understanding and adapt vocabulary and strategies to differentiate and extend individual pupils' understanding. The assessor commentary can be captured holistically or individually, and the commentary must include the justification for the assessment judgment. So did you agree with the marking of the observation? This example is of a student that is working at distinction level. Again, we can clearly see the need for standardisation to enable assessors to make accurate and confident assessment decisions when using the marking criteria. So using the same criteria for S111, please take a few minutes to review this example of structured observation 1. So how will you mark this criteria for this observation? What are the differences here? Is the student working at the same level as the previous example? Let's remind ourselves of the marking criteria. How would you have marked the criteria? So this example of an observation has been awarded 2 marks. Appropriate use of terminology relevant to the subject area and consistently takes opportunities to use prompts and/or questioning techniques to support pupils' understanding. Again, The commentary could be captured holistically, but must make reference to the marking criteria and how that was reached. So the observations and criteria explored today will provide a starting point for your standardisation activities, and these will support you to make accurate assessment decisions and marking judgments. The examples shared today have been taken from the sample materials on QualHub. One is of a student working at distinction level who would typically be achieving the highest marks for each criteria, and the other example is of a student working at a pass. This student would typically achieve 2 marks for each criteria. So let's look at the moderation process for assignment 2. Assignment 2 again is marked by the provider and moderated by NCFE. Moderators will assess judgments and check that they are in line with the NCFE assessment strategy. Assignment 2 Part 1 is moderated on a continuous basis. Moderators will attend a sample of observations carried out by provider assessors. They will observe students alongside assessors and will confirm whether they agree with the assessment judgment. Where there is agreement across the criteria, the provider continues to assess and the student outcomes for competence are accepted by NCFE for the remainder of the delivery, and no further moderation of Assignment 2 Part 1 is required. Where there's not full agreement, the moderator can provide feedback and identify relevant criteria that will need a further check. A further moderation visit will then be required to observe assessment of the relevant criteria. Agreement must be reached across all criteria before the provider is signed off to submit overall outcomes for Assignment 2 Part 1 for that cohort. So the window for moderation is September to February. We do recognise that the situation with the current pandemic has impacted on student engagement and continues to impact. Therefore, we'll be working with providers to plan the moderation visits accordingly. It is important to remember that moderators will need to moderate the assessment decisions of all assessors, and this will allow for all observations, including those already completed, to be recognised as accurate assessment decisions for Early Years Educator Part 1. Moderators will need to see at provider level accurate assessment decisions against all early years criteria. So if there are 2 assessors, moderators will need to observe both assessors, but will not need to see all criteria for each assessor. Equally, the number of students being observed for Early Years Educator Part 1 should be split across the 2 assessors. For example, 2 observations of each assessor. If all criteria is seen across all 4 observations and judged to be accurate assessment decisions, we would not need to moderate any more of Early Years Educator Part 1. So for Part 2 of Early Years Educator and Assignment 2, Assisting Teaching, moderators will attend a sample of structured observations carried out by the assessor during the window of from February until the end of the assessment window. And for this year, the end of the assessment window is the 27th of May. The observations they will attend will be selected by NCFE based on the schedule of assessment and in line with the assessment strategy. The moderator will select structured observations to moderate to ensure that criteria worth at least 40% of the overall mark of Assignment 2 is covered for each student in the sample. This means that students selected for sample will have 2 structured observations sampled by the moderator. The moderator will also ensure that all structured observations are sampled across the cohort. Moderators will observe students alongside the assessor. The assessor will mark the student and the moderator will also mark the student. However, marks will not be compared and outcomes will be captured independently. The moderator will not provide feedback on the outcome of the observation. However, they will review records of completed observations to ensure that sufficient detail is being captured. Once the final marks have been entered onto the portal for all students across the structured observations, final moderation will take place. Provider marks will be compared with moderator marks, and there will be 3 potential outcomes from this activity. So outcome 1 is where the moderator and provider marks are within tolerance, and in this case, all of the provider marks would be accepted with no further action required. Outcome 2 is where the moderator and provider marks are out of tolerance, but they are out of tolerance in a consistent way. For example, they are all too lenient or they are all too strict. In this case, a wider sample of structured observations will be requested to check for consistency, and a calculation would be applied to compare the providers and moderators' marks in order to determine the required adjustment for each student. And this adjustment will then be applied to all students in the cohort. Or we've got outcome 3, where the moderator and provider marks are out of tolerance, but not in a consistent way that can be safely adjusted. In this case, a wider sample will be requested, and if marks continue to be out of tolerance, student evidence may need to be reassessed and moderated. And please be assured that if this were to be the case, support would be granted on an individual basis to make sure that we were fully supporting you throughout this moderation process. And final moderation will take place between May and June, with the occupational specialism grade confirmed in August. So, internal quality assurance. As assignment 2 is moderated externally by NCFE moderators, the IQA will not sign off any assignments. Moderation will involve the assessor and assessor judgments. However, assessment processes and decisions will still be sampled by the IQA and checked for quality and consistency, and this will support the assessor to make accurate assessment decisions. Regular standardisation will continue to take place along with internal quality assurance processes that you may have for support and guidance. So thank you for submitting the questions that you have for this webinar and for our standardisation activity. We will be sending out our responses to your questions, and we will make sure that everybody will receive a copy of the questions. Thank you again for attending the webinar today and for joining in with the standardisation training. Please be reminded that we will be sharing the responses to all questions that you have shared with us throughout the standardisation activity. So from all of us at NCFE, take care and stay safe.